Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. I see people are still coming in here. Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll get started now. Hi, my name is Eric Hayes. I'm the artistic director of the Eugene O'Neill Foundation Dow House, and we're really glad that you've joined us tonight to talk about uh, warnings and before breakfast, and also a new adaptation that is being developed for January entitled Warnings Before Breakfast. With me officially today, I have Beth Wynstra and Zander Brietzke, who are both serving as dramaturgs for this upcoming production. And I'll just share with you that this is a kind of a new thing in that at the foundation, we haven't been involved in taking two plays and doing a mashup, so to speak. And so I thought it would be kind of an interesting idea to have two different dramaturgs at first I thought they would each sort of represent one of the plays, but I found that they had, they jumped around. They wanted, I want that one, not this one, and now they're just dramaturgs for everything, I guess, and I'm fine with that. But yeah, I just to give you an idea of how we're going to conduct our discussion today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my relationship to the material, and then I'm going to turn things over to Zander, who is going to talk about the two plays. And then we will turn things over to Beth, and Beth has some interesting ideas about some trending things, remediation and remix, and kind of looking at how stories are rearranged and create new stories. And she wants to share some information and some insight about that. And that is definitely part. And then we're going to circle back and talk about how that applies to the January project. And then we want to open things up to you, and we have lots of people here. As I said to Beth and Zander, we need to prepare for somebody who knows these plays very well, somebody who just read them, and somebody who doesn't know them at all, and try to kind of meet all of you where you're at, and hopefully we'll generate some interesting things for you to share with us. As far as sharing, we encourage you to put things in the chat at any point. And then later, when we kind of open things up in general, please feel free to raise your hand, either with a little icon or with your actual physical hand, however you want to do it. Let us know you'd like to share something, whether it's a question or a comment or an insight of your own. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to just start again with my relationship to the plays Warnings and Before Breakfast. I started working on Eugene O'Neill in 2008, and I remember reading both these plays very early on. I chose to read the plays in the order they were written, and so that meant I was going to land on these pretty quickly. Warnings, I think, is like about the fourth play he wrote. Anyway, I would say that for the most part, I was never particularly interested in producing these plays or directing these plays, mostly because I had a hard time relating to the characters. And I would say that changed during the pandemic, when I challenged myself to reread the entire canon again during the pandemic. And maybe my own sense of personal isolation got me musing about the isolation that might exist in these two plays and the inner life of the characters in the two plays. And that opened things up for me. And I got very interested in kind of telling the inside story of the people involved in these stories. And I'm going to leave it at that for right now, and turn things over to Zander to talk about the two plays, and we'll go from there. Zander?
Hi. Yes, I'll talk about the two plays briefly, and also briefly about the critical reception of these two plays. You are forgiven if you don't know these two plays. They are, as Eric mentioned, early plays. The first one, Warnings, was written in 1913, never produced. It's kind of a terrible play, but kind of deliciously terrible in a kind of interesting way. And then the second play, Before Breakfast, is 1916. It was the second play produced in the New York version of the Provincetown Players in the 1916-1917 season, and got quite a bit of notoriety, and probably still has some notoriety, although it's also kind of a terrible play too, but and again in an interesting sort of way. And I'd say most of these plays are terrible, but in interesting ways. Warnings is a two-scene play. Scene one, man comes home from having seen the doctor with the news that he's going to lose his hearing, which is unfortunate because he's a wireless operator on a transatlantic ship. It's not coincidental, probably, that 1913, the year this play is written, is the year in which the Titanic sinks. And there are several O'Neill plays sort of around that, and other playwrights writing about that subject as well. Scene one, he says, I'm losing my hearing. His wife and all their poor children say, no, Dad, you can't quit your work. Husband, you can't quit your work because we'll starve to death. He tries to get out of it, but then eventually says, okay, I'll do one more voyage. We know how that's going to turn out. And in scene two, in fact, he's aboard ship. He's lost his hearing. The ship has hit an iceberg, a la Titanic. And the wireless operator, James Knapp, is unable to hear vessels that would ordinarily offer assistance. And as a result, the name of the ship, which the name of the ship escapes me. For some reason, I'm thinking Empress, but I don't think that's right.
That's right.
It is Empress. Okay, the Empress is going to sink. They're abandoning ship, and he commits suicide. End of play. Before Breakfast, I can do a shorter summary of that. Woman on stage alone harangues her offstage husband about never getting a job and supporting her. She yells. He never says anything. She hands him a bowl of water for his shaving. He commits suicide. She screams. End of play. It's not a laugh riot, but comic in some respects. The critical reception of these plays is very interesting in that, and can, historically, like I can, like in the, if we go back, 50 years, Dean of O'Neill criticism, Travis Bogard, with whom we're all familiar, would go on about the men in these plays being the victims of these harpy women. Fast forward 50 years, we get 2023, Beth Wynstra's new book makes us see the plays in a different way, perhaps, encourages us to see them in a different way, perhaps. These men are lousy. These women are victim of these lousy men. These men are terrible. And then we get Warnings Before Breakfast, this new unseen play by Eric Fraisher Hayes, this mashup of these two terrible plays that I told you, which I think sort of mediates this ground of somehow neither the man nor the woman are terrible, but they're somehow very human, and these plays are, and what we'll talk about is how there are multiple sides to see all these things, and sort of mediates the position of who's a villain, who's wrong, who's right, and I think some interesting ways, which I hope will be the discussion as we go forward. I use that term mediation consciously, because as I turn the microphone over to Beth Wynstra, she's going to not only talk about mediation, but the idea of remediation and remixing. Beth.
Thank you. Thank you, Zander. And hi, everyone. It's so great to be here and to see so many familiar, friendly faces. I, like Zander, I have such enthusiasm for this new project of Eric's. And I don't, Eric, I don't know if he realized it, but he's so trendy right now with this remix. I'm going to use that word remix of these two plays. And I shared with Zander and Eric, and some of you who are at universities and in writing programs. I know at my own home institution, Babson College, a big centerpiece of our writing program is the teaching of what we call remediation and remix. So that word remediation is really just the process of taking one text, whether that's a newspaper article or a story or a film, and reworking, translating it into a new medium. So the director of the writing program at my college, I've heard him lecture and do classroom activities around remediation. And he always uses as the example, the text of Alice in Wonderland being remediated into Jefferson Airplane's White Rabbit. So you have, this text and it's a story, and then it's kind of retranslated into a song. So that's remediation. And then a key tool of this is remix, which I think a lot of us know from songs, but really just altering a work from its original state by adding, removing, or changing part of the original item. So, I was saying to Eric that, this is what is really being taught in a lot of universities right now, because the belief is that students, as they go into the real world and working with creating digital media, so much of digital media works on a remediation that's what the kind of currency is. And so that's what is really being centered in a lot of writing programs. So I was thinking about these topics and thinking about, O'Neill as kind of one of, an original remixer. A lot of us know certainly a play like Morning Becomes Electra, I think, is a remix of Aeschylus's Electra, and O'Neill was interested in removing, adding, making it available for current audiences. But, in Eric's project, he's kind of, done something else of putting these two plays together in which scenes back up to one another. And we have characters from one play interacting with characters from another, with I think the hope that we then, recognize this as its own play and see its merit and celebrate it, but also think back to those original texts and what has been highlighted from Eric's project. And Zander, Eric, and I have had great conversation about how, we really see now the original texts in a different way. I see Mrs. Rowland very differently thanks to Eric's project, because we're getting new context and new elements remixed in. So that's just kind of a little introduction. Eric, I'll turn it back to you to talk about some of the remixing you did, maybe.
Sure. Thank you, Beth. To go back to a little bit of my what got me interested in the play, I really I would say with warnings, and I hope most people have read it or know it, but basically the man who's losing his hearing has this first scene where he's in a domestic environment. He's with his family, and you learn that he's losing his hearing, but there's a lot of pressure on him. He needs to keep the job to help the family. And then the second scene is aboard a ship, and there's been an accident. And I really started focusing on the idea of losing hearing and not being able to hear. And I thought there was an interesting parallel. Then I also I was always before breakfast, I was always interested in what's going on in the other room. There's this woman who does this monologue basically to a man that is basically unseen, except supposedly for his hand. He's heard sometimes, but not seen. And I was just, it's interesting to think, and this, Beth, we could get into this too, a bit about hearing, because I know that was one of the questions you were generating. But the idea that in one play the character's losing his hearing, and the other play, the woman is not being heard. Um, and I just got really interested in how they kind of interact. I wanted to, as was said earlier, I wanted to show both people as equally as possible. And so, Warnings has these two scenes. The first scene with the family, and the second scene on a ship. And at the urging, I've had at the urging of Beth and Zander, who said, "This part's boring. I need to fix it."
I didn't say that. Okay, to say the other dramaturg used that language.
I thought it.
We all know who said that,
right? But they gave me the idea of what if I dropped the second scene into the first scene, so that literally he was experiencing what could be a premonition, could be a fear, an anxiety, a memory, I don't know what, of what could happen aboard the ship while he was still with his family, having those discussions and arguments with his family members. So in a sense, he's playing out worst case scenarios. And I thought that that would help really feed. I really was interested in exploring his psyche, with his dilemma, and to find ways to theatricalize his anxieties. And with that said, some of you, and many of you, may know the play Emperor Jones. And Emperor Jones, in scene 2, O'Neill has this sort of creation he calls the formless fears, who are these kind of shapeless creatures with little beady white eyes, who show up, and Brutus Jones is very unnerved by them and runs away. When I did a production of Emperor Jones, I decided to use the formless fears in all the scenes. They would basically take the shape of whatever the anxiety that was being expressed in the scene. And so in that spirit, I find myself with an ensemble of 3 formless fears for our play, who basically will enact the roles of family members or people on the ship for the man. And with Before Breakfast, it's written as a monologue, but in a spirit of wanting to balance out the story, I felt the need to create scenes based on what we know from the text. So, for instance, if you know Before Breakfast, there's a letter. It's a letter from another woman. Her name is Helen. So it became completely logical for me to, this character, the woman, now needs to interact with Helen in some form. And actually found multiple ways in which she interacts with this woman from the letter, who is having an affair with her husband and is pregnant from her husband. And what anxieties does that help kind of theatricalize and help us understand more deeply about what the woman is going by? And by the way, I for the script, I'm just referring to woman, who is written as Mrs. Rowland in Before Breakfast, or James Knapp as man, because I'm really trying to emphasize that it's their stories. And one of my kind of logics about that is, when it's your story, you don't need to have a name. Everyone else has a name. You don't need a name because you know your name. It's your story. So anyway, it's man and woman, and I'm sort of literally and figuratively wanted to jump back and forth between the multiple stories. If you know the play Huey, it's kind of like going on the Erie is all outside, and the night clerk Charlie is all inside, interior. And in this play, we're trying to play with going inside and outside of both characters, back and forth. And it's just kind of a crazy dance, but I find that it's really interesting to think that, for instance, the fear that takes the shape of James Knapp, the man's wife, is also going to take other shapes in the story of Mrs. Rowland, woman. And so so there's this possibility for all these dualities. Is that's your wife in one scene? Is that your wife in the other person's story too? Or just, it will obviously be the same actor. And I'm not being literal about it, but I've at some points I've tried to draw on parallels, things they say in one play, I reiterated in the created part of other scenes in the other play, so that there'd be extra possibilities there. And I'm fine with vagueness as long as there's just multiple possibilities, and it's intriguing and engaging. Anyway, Beth, and would you want to touch on some of the questions you generated and some things?
Yes. Well, I will say, you know, to use the term, you know, of remix, again, bringing in elements of Emperor Jones into this play, I mean, is another kind of form of that, right? Borrowing and bringing it into this world. And I see, having been able to read the script, and I'm so happy for so many of you will be able to see it in January. And I'm also happy that I know that Cynthia is here. I don't know if other actors are here. It is going to be a good workout for actors. And Eric, as you all know, has an amazing, you know, cast of actors always. So they'll do a great job. But I like these formless fears because, you know, I do think in the spirit of remediation, it gives new light to these characters from the original plays, and to be able to see woman who, you know, is Mrs. Rowland, all that she's wrestling with internally, including, you know, the imaginary conversations that she would be having with her husband's mistress, is really fascinating and adds a whole other kind of level of context and nuance that I think really helps us move past nagging wife, or in the case of Mr. Knapp, man, passive husband, which I think in these plays, that can be a very easy place to go. And so the addition of these fears that they both have and they both wrestle with and talk to and have to deal with is just a really compelling addition to the worlds. And I think the fact that they're shared, both characters have them, forms a really interesting link, is what I'm thinking with those characters.
Definitely.
Zander, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in on anything here.
I do want to jump in.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, I mean, I was thinking again, you know, and I said this to you guys earlier, and I was thinking of it again as Eric was just speaking about the way what he was seeing with the two plays put together, but with the formless fears and these other voices. And one of the things, you know, to go back, you know, that I'm put off by in a play like Warnings is the certain kind of inevitability of it all. Certain, he says this, she says this, son says this. It's you can see you can see the iceberg in the distance, in the way that the real ship never did, in the way we don't really in real life. But you can see it in the play. And there's a way in the play, in the script that in the last version that I've read, that the dialogue made me start thinking about, you know, who people are talking to. Eric started talking about, you know, listening and hearing, but there's a real question in the play about who's speaking to whom. And in performance, I would imagine that will get a little even more confusing because we're seeing kind of two plays side by side. But I mean, the reality, I mean, one thing bugs me about most plays is the dialogue, because it's like, well, that's X says this and Y responds and says this. But in reality, and one of the things I got to look in the script is that there's all sorts of voices in conversation, even when there's only two people or even one person on stage. You know, you're talking to your dead grandmother, you're talking to your boyfriend who left you years ago and you've never forgiven, even though you're in a happy relationship going forward, you're still talking about something back then. And all those voices are there all the time. It's a question of who's talking and who's listening and who's on, you know, it's not just the person right there, but you're still trying to, you know, prove to your father that, you know, you're still worthy or something, even though he's been dead for 35 years. And that's interesting. It's interesting in this play how these voices are, you know, it's not psychotic. It's real. I mean, it's like you're hearing these things, and there's a question in the play where the voices are coming from. Is it the next door neighbor? You're hearing something through the wall, or is it somebody in the next room that's contiguous to it, or is it a separate space completely? And all those things are. I mean, as staged, I imagine I can see are both can be true all at the same time. And that's, I mean, I think that's an interesting, you know, it becomes, you know, hyper real at a certain point.
one thing I felt like sharing is this play is being done at the Museum of the San Ramon Valley, which some of you have been to and many have not. But it's a freight room of an 1891 railroad station that's now a museum. But the lighting situation is very rudimentary, but it actually fits this play quite well in the sense that one end of the room will be a stage, and I have the ability to focus light on one half of the stage or the other half. And no matter what, when I focus the light on one half, you will still be able to see in half light the other half. And in this play, that serves, I think, really well, because one of the interesting things that is going to be just undiscovered territory until I get in there with actors is how do you show how one story is affecting the other person in the other story on the other half of the stage. They will be in half light. My idea is that they either literally hear the other person's story or they feel it somehow, and the audience will be constantly aware that they're there, because there's no ability to make one half of the stage just disappear. It'll always be in semi-light. So I really like, actually, in this case, how that serves to give, focus to the side that I want people to focus on, but to always keep an awareness of the other side of the story, which I think in this instance will really be beneficial.
So I see in the chat some questions or things I will about hearing, and that the thread of hearing, and I will mention that in Eric's play some variation of the word hear is used nearly 40 times, both in dialogue and stage direction. So this idea of what the characters hear, how they don't really listen to one another. Those of you who have been lucky to see Eric's works from, I think, the last 5 years, I think that the lack of listening has been a real constant theme in a lot of the plays that he's been exploring, and certainly in these works, how the characters deal with not hearing, or when they're hearing the formless fears and are wrestling internally, what does that look like to their partner on stage, and how does a partner respond to that? So that was something that I just would want to point out. I also see in the chat, Eric, why is it named Warnings Before Breakfast and not Before Breakfast Warnings? I don't know, Eric, if you...
I suppose to be truly circular, it should be warnings before breakfast, before warnings, before or breakfast before before breakfast, warnings before breakfast. I don't know, but it does kind of tap into a thought about the warning aspect, and it is literally referred to in the play Warnings about how this person not hearing the messages of a derelict ship that they were going to run into ahead of time causes the accident. But I also obviously was kind of tapped into the notion that that these stories were going on one level. They could serve as warnings. I almost like the idea of the play being in a loop, where it could cycle in a loop, but somehow you're a little bit wiser. It's like Groundhog's Day, quite honestly. If you can think about how each time through it, you've learned something, hopefully, and you're trying to use it somehow. And I can imagine one version or one interpretation of what we're doing in January could be that all of this was sort of a series of premonitions or efforts within each of the characters to find a way to connect to the other character or empathize with the other character before they actually interacted with them physically. But the order of words, I just warnings became before breakfast is just kind of how I first thought of it. That's all. Could be either.
So one thing, and I'm going to turn to Zander, because Zander's future book project about ashcan painters and the settings of both of these plays, at least part one of Warnings and Before Breakfast, that these plays kind of link because of where they're both set. So I don't know if, Zander, you want to kick us off about settings for both of these plays and why that might be significant?
Well, they're both sort of Lower East Side tenement type settings. Actually, I mean, Warnings is specifically set in the Bronx, which I don't know don't know how well. I mean, Harry Ape has the Bronx Zoo, I guess, but it might as well be on the Lower East Side. Before breakfast is Greenwich Village, in a sort of, you know, one room apartment. It's kind of getting into this. O'Neill was living around there moved to New York in 1915, so he's there. The Bronx scene he doesn't describe the Bronx actually seems insignificant in that title, but he is kind of referring to the sort of the sort of down and out existence. And I think there's in Mornings there's 6 people living in this rather small apartment. There's husband, wife, older son, daughter, baby, and then there's another son, Jim, who's gone, but occasionally sends a couple of bucks to help out the rent. Yeah. So he's not been gone long. I think so. Five, and Jim who's just left in maybe a 2-bedroom. I mean, there's it's house. There's not a lot of description of either place. The other, before breakfast is practically an empty apartment. Is very even though she's sort of sweeping up, and there's again very little description of what's left. There's a lot of talk about everything's gone because they've sold everything and they've only got, the before breakfast is a little bit ironic as a subject. She says there is actually nothing for breakfast. I might give you, there's coffee, maybe. That's going to figure in Eric's play. Yeah, and there's there may be a little bit of bread and butter, which of course the title of another play that O'Neill wrote. That bread and butter does not actually really appear in the play. I think although she may go to butter a piece of bread at one point. But it's these are piecemeal existences. To be fair, I think O'Neill's at his best when he's talking about the down and out and the hard scrabbled lives, and these are certainly 2 of those. They're not well-to-do in any sense, but I think in Before Breakfast, there's a little bit more sense of the environment and what's around. And that's probably because O'Neill was living right there.
No, the stage direction from Warnings that I always find so heartbreaking is in the opening that, exactly what Zander described. But like, I think above the mantle is a Home Sweet Home little placard or needlepoint or something that is just and of course as the play goes on, it's anything but that. But there is this kind of ideal, and some of the other things that are, I know, around on Warning, some of the picture frames, it's like what a house should be or what we should be. And I think that comes out in Before Breakfast too, with cleaning up and sweeping, and we have these expectations that we should be keeping house and having these things. And we know, I think in both works, expectations are kind of a death knell, because when partners start expecting too much or have certain expectations locked, disaster strikes. But I'm thinking about
that's pretty gendered in the plays as written too. The women feel very cheated. I would say, justifiably so, in a way, but they've in the first play, Warnings, Mrs. Knapp, I think she gets kind of a bad rap in the sort of Travis Bogard sense. Tradition, in that she's raising all those kids. The husband's gone all the time. He's at sea. They don't have enough money, and there's a way, as written, that she is completely manipulating her husband to do something, and that is not give up his job, but for good reasons. And there's an aspect of the play that's really performative too. There's a way in which she's very well aware that she's playing this part, even
Really.
she's playing this part of this kind of harpy, because in fact there's even a great stage direction, I think, at the end, when after he says, okay, I'll go one more voyage, and she kind of, you know, has this sort of sigh of relief, and kind of like, you know, it's, you know, she realizes she hasn't even met, so, you know, she's had all these lines like, you know, why did I marry such a man, you're so, but this was all part of this manipulation to get him to do something, and she's basically saying, well, that's, you know, I had to do what I had to do.
Yes.
And I think that's true. She did have to do that.
And even earlier, I think I liked on, you know, even earlier before that great scene you've mentioned, Zander, like the way that she props up her husband for the children when he's not there. You know, she keeps saying, when your father gets home, he's head of the household, where in fact that's not true, because she's earning money as well. He's not making enough. So she's propping him up as like, wait till your father gets home, he's the head of the household, but in fact he's not. Like, that's also a performance that she's kind of performing what a family should be, where dad comes home, he's the breadwinner, but in fact,
well, and these plays are pre-suffrage.
Yes.
The women, you know, didn't have too many options. Both women seem like they might be fully capable of having jobs, careers, and so on. So, but it's sort of unfair from our lofty perspective to say, you know, well, you should have a life of your own. You know, she's both women get paid minimal amounts, and so they do feel they thought they were improving their lives through these marriages, when in fact, you know, they were probably not.
And I see in the chat, Robin wanted to mention that Mr. Rowland is a poet, and probably improving your life with a poet was not the best choice, as we know from Mrs. Rowland. But yes, I think that is correct. And kind of being to your point of pre-suffrage, and yet they're working, they're making money, but could never be seen as, you know, a prominent role in the household. So it's almost like they're caught in this in-between world or something like that, that they're doing work, they're adding to the family, but yet can't have some kind of position where, you know, what the men would be sweeping up or making breakfast or contributing in that way. So it is really interesting.
It seems to really tap into that age-old discussion of division of labor, and these women seem to have to do all this stuff at home, and they both, as you said, work for some kind of money outside of the house as well, but the times seem to indicate that whatever they earn out there couldn't possibly support them. So that's just again another reflection of the times that they're trapped in both cases. I would also like to say that I love in Warnings, the wallpaper is described as impossible green, which I think is just fantastic. It kind of says something about the kind of place they have to. Oh, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but I believe in the Warnings house, because they have all those kids, they have a curtain up. They describe there's a curtain, which I guess is a way to divide their rooms even more. The rooms they have, they need to divide even more with curtains. Says something about, actually, I was amazed, and I don't know if you guys have any more to say about this, but I was amazed at how many times both plays talked about money. They're both really huge preoccupations. I mean, it just kind of goes to the idea that both stories are kind of nestled in a flat in New York where people are struggling. So it was it actually helped me a lot to think about how to toggle back and forth, considering that many times they were talking about similar things.
They were. Yeah. And I think for both women, to Zander's point earlier, it's like there was this expectation that marrying meant they didn't have to worry, or that was going to be the husband's responsibility. And suddenly they're in these worlds where it's their responsibility, they have to worry about it and make the money also. So there's a disconnect between expectations and then what actually ends up happening in both of these marriages, which is something that I think gets repeated alongside the money, Eric, that
Yeah,
it's
and there's
money and that I have to earn it. I wasn't expecting it. I should be laying on my, bed and relaxing, right? Yeah.
there's a Willy Loman aspect of certainly warnings too, of that, he's aging out of his job. They're going to replace him, and and they're going to replace him before he needs to work longer than he's going to be allowed to. And so what happens then? You would think, he's a wireless operator on a transatlantic ship. That ought to provide sufficient income. And we say, the same thing about many jobs now.
Hi, this is Robin. I wanted to just jump in and say something about these two women in particular that were all kind of, what's the word, trying to understand them and their pretty horrendous nastiness. And what I found interesting is that O'Neill clearly loved women, and later plays he wrote women that were living around this same time. And I think of Touch of the Poet and even earlier. And he wrote much, much more, I'm going to say, sympathetic and much more balanced women who were not in this kind of rage all the time. And I'm sort of wondering if that's occurred, that why O'Neill began writing and wrote these kinds of women, and then later on he wrote what I would call women that we don't have to look at their life and say, oh, well, I have to understand why she was so mean. It wasn't her fault, because there were other women that he wrote at the same time and even earlier that are far kinder, far more loving, in some cases a little bit manipulative. But that's just a thought that occurred to me, because as much as I try to understand these two women in this play, there's nobody I'd ever want to be around, and I don't particularly like them.
Yeah, let me say one thing about it. One way I'm trying with this production is having worked on a number of O'Neill plays at this point, I'm kind of aware of his early plays and his later plays. And I like to think that I've learned enough that I can bring things that I think O'Neill exhibits in his later plays and loop them back into an earlier play. And I think in some ways that's what I'm doing with the women. I think the women, well, I should say woman. I kind of treat it as one woman and one man, but everyone else is a fear of some sort. But that they're more understandable and more sympathetic and more well-rounded. And I think and it has to do with maybe how these other scenes create context for them that you wouldn't see necessarily otherwise. And I'd like to think that is an extension of knowing O'Neill's body of work and being able to learn from many of his plays and see how I can apply it to a telling of this story.
Could I jump in here? Can you hear me? Am I?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm glad as the discussion has developed that you started dealing more with the sociological surrounding that we know now. But I was thinking that he wrote, first of all, he's an early playwright, so he's just trying things out. Misogyny was common in the culture, at the time, to blame the woman or whatever. So that's there. But also I think he's writing in that realism, naturalism style that, the Abbey Theater, they wrote in, and it was an influence on him. And the idea, I think, was to look at it as if it's under the play as if the people are under a microscope and you're seeing how they behave given what their situation is. But I also think it implies knowing the context of, say, tenement life and sixth grade educations, if they had that much. And he's got no workers' compensation, disability, Social Security, no union, and she's not even allowed to work outside the home except to do laundry or or what else, cleaning, if she could even leave the home, because she's got 5 children, so she doesn't have birth control. And I was thinking, for the director, this is the problem of doing these plays. I think these early plays, without the context, at least if you've got one of the sea plays, they're on a ship, and that gives you a huge context there as to what life is like on the ship amongst the men. And but this, I mean, the woman does end up, it's just like in Beyond the Horizon later on, even though there's more context, and they have this farm that, illusion, focus Beyond the Horizon in comparison would focus more on lost dreams, lost illusions, whereas it seemed to me O'Neill was trying to show things sociologically in front of audiences probably have a better time. They have the same time frame. They see people like this, or all the time. And so I was thinking, actually, Beth, with your cultural anthropology, your background, your interest in that, with your new wonderful book, that I was just thinking, it's a problem for a director. I mean, unless you had displays in the lobby about the labor movement coming up, the women's right to vote coming up, birth, the arguments or the discussions about birth control and things like that. There's no frame of reference as you read this play for young people. The women just seem to be they're nagging for no reason at all,
I would say one thing. I think maybe a lot of the women come off as nagging in these early plays because so many of these plays are kind of sort of embodiments or representations of the O'Neill, the young man who wants to be an artist and mostly thinks of the women as getting in the way. They're not allowing him to be his true self. And later on, hopefully, he's a little more in touch with his true self, and he doesn't have to represent women that way, and he finds much more broader, interesting representations. Oh, I see we have a hand up. Katie Johnson, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you all so much for this. It's so interesting to think of this remix and remediation and mashup. It's getting me to think in so many ways about how the two texts resonate with each other. And, I was looking again at what Mrs. Knapp says, and I really think it's interesting that if we take what she says, at face value, it's really, I think it in some ways, one could have some sympathy for her plight as a working class woman. She says, you're eating the best of food and you're talking to pretty women in first class. And here I am, cooking, scrubbing, taking care of the children, putting off the grocer, and doing the washing and saving every penny. Like, she's at her wit's end, and I guess maybe we give O'Neill credit for giving her those lines. She's able to give voice to that deep frustration, and also to have these like impossible decisions that one has to make that probably working class people still make, and which is when you're desperate and you're still going to work, even knowing, let's say you have COVID and you might put people at risk, or because you don't get paid if you don't show up, right? Or you're, in this case, maybe it will be okay, if you show up and you can't hear properly, and, what are the chances that you're going to hit an iceberg, so I'm also thinking, and if anyone can do this, Eric, it's you and your wonderful cast and your team of dramaturgs to bring the archive onto the stage so that people do get a sense of that, like, dire, those pressing circumstances that we do see in the text, even this very imperfect and, sort of not our full O'Neill kind of plays, these early one acts.
Yes, thank you. Herman, do you have something to say?
Sure. Just in kind of response to even the question that was asked about, or the comment that was made about the treatment of the women, and sort of riffing off of what Katie just said. I think part of the reason why he's doing what he's doing, which is treating these women so poorly, is I'll offer up my perspective as a playwright. Early playwrights tend to be derivative, and at this point, he's sort of echoing and following sort of the tropes of melodrama with certainly warnings. And melodrama was very predictable. That iceberg that Zander talked about, it's very clear that we know it's coming. That whole setup and payoff in the second scene is just like, oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. But that was the period, and those were the types of plays that he knew were out there, especially in his father's theater. And then with Before Breakfast, I did have a chance to look at Contours in Time this afternoon, and Travis Bogard notes that it's an homage to Strindberg, and it's his own takeoff on The Stronger, and it's also apparently, according to Edna Kenton, he had said at some point, I think it was in her book, that he wanted to experiment with how long you can go with a monologue in that play. So I think that's part of it. But I do think he's also, I read it carefully because I was being very turned off by these women and their treatment. And I read these years ago and went back this afternoon. And when I was reading it, I could see that there was, as Katie was just saying, some sympathy, and I think Beth was pointing this out as well, the sympathy for these women in their condition. Travis also pointed out, it's one of the first plays he's writing about a domestic situation. He does it with the web, of course. It's not really a domestic situation, of course, because it's a prostitute, but still she's in home and she has a child. But here now, just a few plays later, he's dealing with a home situation. I would argue the Bronx is significant, and this is where I'm getting my Bronx up, because that was a burgeoning middle class area in that time, 1913. If you were moving out of the Lower East Side, you were moving to the Bronx, and there was hope and possibility. And I think there's a reference early on in the stage directions for Mrs. Knapp that she says she's kind of lost her kind of expectations of what she was hoping for. She's beleaguered by raising all these children and not having enough of the bare necessities. So all of that, I think he's siding with her to some extent in that opening and the way she's talking. And then if you cut over to Before Breakfast, I was thinking, because Ryan O'Neill just died, it's kind of like a love story, because he's a Harvard graduate, millionaire child, and she expected things to pick up, and then her father lost all the money, and all that's in that backstory that she's yelling at him about how much of a disgrace he is. So I thought that was kind of fascinating, but I do feel like that treatment is there. But I did have a question for you, Eric, because you said that you felt that Before Breakfast was about a character who's speaking, who's not being heard. I mean, I read that play that everything that's happening off stage and the suicide that's to come is because he is hearing everything she's saying. Everything she's got that letter. She's found out that he's been fooling around on her. This is her moment of revelation. And to me, it feels like every action that's being referenced by O'Neill off stage is him engaging in the slow act of killing himself. So I would believe that offstage person who apparently O'Neill played at one point was actually hearing everything that she was saying. So
yeah, I would say that when I talk about her not being heard, it's more about how it's affecting her internal state. She gets nothing from the man in the other room, and so that is what's driving her anxiety. Is she's getting no confirmation of being heard. Yeah, that's how I'm taking that, actually, or that's how I'm looking with it.
Can I add one more thing here? Other than like Herman with the love story reference, you'll be happy that Eric has put it in the line, love means never having to say you're sorry, he hasn't, but I think he should add it just as a little homage, a little remix there. What the part about listening though, I think there's something about in both of these plays, listening, but not seeing or something, because in both plays, the women's labor, whether it is cooking, cleaning, raising the children, is not seen by the men because they are off stage. So I think it's one thing to hear, I'm doing this work or whatever, but the men don't have to see it. So I think there's a disconnect there of just hearing a woman say it as opposed to watching her sweep, make the coffee, raise the children. Mr. Knapp is gone through a huge part of the beginning of Warnings, and we know Mr. Rowland is off stage. So there's something about neither of them are actually fully seeing, and thus I would argue not fully hearing and comprehending what the women do.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I see Dan McGovern. Do you have something to contribute? Oh, you're muted right now.
And no longer. I would just like to point out that this endeavor represents an important point in the evolution of the foundation and of its relationship with the society. In the 7 years that I've been involved with the foundation, we've used the opportunities we've had to present plays in the at the museum, mostly as an opportunity to give plays that were not well received, that we felt were underappreciated, a second chance to make a first impression. And I've felt that the plays that we have done before, actually a very good case can be made for each of them. And I think we reached a kind of crescendo with Eric's superb production of Welded, which by all accounts just got better and better in each of its iterations in St. Louis and then in New Ross. When Eric brought this idea to Carol and me quite some time ago, it was not, at least it wasn't expressed to us, maybe it was already well formed in Eric's mind, but it was expressed to us that we would be presenting these two plays. And I appreciate the fact that Zander has given me permission to say these are two terrible plays. And I said to Eric, no one else would produce these two plays, and that's exactly the reason we should produce these two plays. But it's fascinating now to see, as has been explained so well through the course of this discussion, the opportunity that these two plays offer us to create through Eric and Beth and Zander and the cast that Eric will assemble, something new, something important. And the other thing I would like to point out is that it represents an even greater moment in our collaboration with the society, which during the period of time I've been associated with the foundation has just become stronger and stronger and more productive. And I want everyone to know how grateful the foundation is for that relationship and how much we value it and how much we're getting out of it. And so thank you, members of the society, dramaturgs. Thank you, Eric, for being creative in bringing members of the society into our productions and into our dramatic life here. I think it's an exciting project. When it's put on the boards, I may still say to myself, these are two terrible plays, but it's an interesting journey.
Thank you, Dan. I wanted to quickly acknowledge a couple of comments that I've seen in the comment section. Steve, a while ago, Steve Bloom, you asked about the warnings, the notion of warnings being, in a literal sense in the play about warnings on a ship, but then maybe the warnings are more about the life at home and domestic life at home. And I would concur that I see both these plays. There may be a ship in this play that we're doing in January, but this is a domestic story. This is definitely rooted in the domestic tensions and anxieties of these characters in these two stories that I will say are one story to me at this point. And another thing I just want to throw in, Jeff, you made a comment in the thing about the casualness of Mrs. Rowland, or what I call her woman, learning of the affair that her husband's having, and that there's a pregnancy, and then she's able to kind of transition right to talking about mundane things like there's not enough money or the bread is stale or something. And I just say about that this particular interpretation that we're doing in January, that I'd like to emphasize that sometimes what someone says and what they're feeling are two different things. So at times, I think the Mrs. Rowland character has something more important on her mind to say, but backs off of it and goes back to something more mundane because that's safer ground for her. And also with the theatrical devices we're employing, there's opportunities for something mundane to be talked about and then something a lot more profound to be enacted in her presence, which is one of the more exciting aspects of the way we're interpreting things.
Hi, it's Robin. I got to chime in on that. I love that. What I think is fascinating is that, so these plays are written around the time that I believe Stanislavski was getting started with the Moscow Art Theater obviously in Moscow. And the whole concept of subtext and saying one thing and meaning another was just starting to come to the fore in those productions of the Moscow Art Theater, and much, much more so in Stanislavski's writings throughout the 1920s and the early 30s. And what I love is how O'Neill must have been channeling something, because here's a perfect example of the statement, finding out that the mistress is pregnant, but not blowing up about it, but obviously very, very, I would assume it'd be very much in her mind, and the subtext would be very powerful, regardless of whatever she's saying in the scene. And I just love the fact that the juxtaposition of Stanislavski doing what he was doing, and then here's O'Neill writing fertile material for actors and directors to work with the same concept.
Mhm.
Great, thank you, Robin. Beth, Zander, is there anything else you'd like to say? I think we should wind it up pretty soon. Is there anything else on your mind?
I actually want to go back to refer back to what Katie was talking about earlier in the passage that you read, Katie, from Warnings about Mrs. Knapp imagining the great life that her husband had, away at sea. And while I think it's important that we have the sociological context of these plays and reflect back, that was then, this is now. I mean, who among us now has not referred to a thought about the spouse or loved one or domestic partner or whatever who's got a better life right now than you do, and that they're going out doing when you're stuck, changing the diapers or something at home. And the wonderful thing about the thing in the play is that Knapp is undoubtedly not mixing it up with the first class. He's not saying hello to the family. I mean, he's this little guy who doesn't do anything interesting probably on that ship. But she imagines it, and there's a way in which, of course, it is better than her life, and there's probably ways in which it's not. But we all have that, and I think that's the sociological context, historical aspect, important. But I mean, there's a in these relationships. And I think that's actually true in a good production of O'Neill's plays as doing straight. And I think it's even comes out possibly more in Eric's script and undoubtedly in the performance of it later, is this imagining that somebody's got it better, that your partner's got it better as a way of coping and dealing with your own, present disasters. And then it changes, the script, changes, and then that your partner is thinking the exact same thing. Like, I hate going to work. I mean, I would rather be home with it, but it's, we have that. And then we kind of come together and we realize that, and we, mix it up a little bit, remediate it and remix it.
Or you kill yourself.
Well,
Yes.
that's all coming.
Happy holidays on that note.
We're all gonna do that.
You're good, Beth? You all good?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I'm good.
All right. Well, hey, everyone, thank you so much for joining us and delving into these plays a little bit and letting us share a little bit about what we're doing in January. And hope that we have some good things to report to you. If you're not able to actually join us in January, I encourage you to do so. And if you're not, hopefully there'll be something to say about it afterwards that we can share with you. All right. But anyway, thank you very much. And as Beth said, happy holidays to everyone else. Take care.
Hi, Robin. Thanks,
hopefully.
Robin.
Bye-bye.
Great work, you guys. Bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Kate.